think it would probably be wonderful if we'll start at the end and we can introduce ourselves to make sure that everyone in the room knows the exciting panel that you have before you. So we'll start at our end.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sandy Nessing, and I'm Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer at American Electric Power. We do not serve the state of New York, so a little bit about who we are. We are one of the largest electric utilities in the United States, and we, fun fact, we used to introduce ourselves as the largest coal-burning electric utility in the Western Hemisphere. We do not do that anymore, and we've made a pretty significant shift to clean energy that hopefully we'll get a little bit of a chance to talk about, but it's a pretty big movement. We've already retired almost about 14,000 megawatts of coal, with another over 5,300 this decade. So making huge progress, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pete Underwood. I am the Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Fordham Corporation, not to be confused with Fordham, although I noticed how they sound quite a bit alike.
Well, we share the F.
We share the F and the O and the R. And, in the world of sustainability at Fordham, I lead our sustainability program as well as our EH&S program. Fordham is an industrial technology company. We're based in Everett, Washington, but we own companies around the globe. It's kind of difficult to describe what we do. In my prior job, we made electric motors. That was easy. In this job, it's a little harder to describe. But I will say we work in 5 different customer workflows. One of those customer workflows is around environmental health and safety. We own a business called Industrial Scientific, which provides gas detection services and equipment. We also own a company called Intellex, which is one of the nation's leading providers of EH&S software. So we're squarely in the space in at least one of our 5 workflows, and I'm excited to be here.
Thank you so much.
Mariella, CEO, co-founder of Datamaran. It's a software company. We are focused on building technology solutions for ESG professionals and C-suite with a specific focus on ESG strategy and risk management. We work globally. We have 130 clients, and we work with partners EY, DLA Piper, Deloitte, and more, and Intellex. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I'm Barbara Porso, and I will be your moderator today. The theme of today's panel is the E in ESG does not mean easy. I love that. What I think would be really enjoyable for our audience is if we can look a little bit at the current state of ESG. And really focus on the trends that are developing, what you're noticing, and maybe be a little predictive. I think about what you see is going on now and what you see is going on in the future. And we have European background on the panel, so maybe we can juxtapose US and the European markets as well. So why don't I start with you, my dear, right next to me?
Yeah, sure. So I think when I think about the current state of ESG, is that it has finally reached let's say the upper echelons of corporations. And also what we're seeing is that a lot of newcomers are getting started. And what's excited about companies that are getting started is that they typically get started from the top down. So I think we've done a lot of learning along the years on how this is best done, and there's been a lot of push, uphill battle. But the ones that are starting new, they tend to start from the top down with board oversight and various ESG committees at the board, C-suite very much involved, ESG integrated into a financial report, not necessarily a separate sustainability report. So I think that is incredibly exciting to see. In terms of EU versus US, I always feel like there's a tendency in the US to think they're behind the European Union, and maybe it's because it's been around longer and more institutionalized. But I think there's also opportunity here for the US to, if the US gets its head around it, it catches up very fast, and it can lead also very fast. So we're seeing a lot of newcomers in the United States, also in response to what's happening at the SEC. And in the European Union, of course, the developments around the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, institutionalizing materiality. So a lot of things happening, getting very serious.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because you see that we may have been slower to come but now that we're there, we'll move quickly. I mean, the expression, a New York minute seems to be faster in this area than anywhere else, so.
Sometimes with our European clients, we find that that there's this idea of we've been doing this for a very long time. We know how it's done. So I think there's more. I personally find there's a bit more openness in the U.S. to start anew and start fresh and new ideas.
Excellent, excellent, because sometimes it's harder to deconstruct than it is to
Exactly.
start fresh.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Pete, what are you thinking?
Well, I've been in this world, meaning leading a sustainability or an EHS function for about a dozen years. And there's no question as to what's happened in the last 3 or 4. And I remember saying this 10 years ago that, this is moving kind of fast. It's coming really soon and we're gonna have to be on top of it. And that's just done nothing but a hockey stick upward. And what I mean by that is attention that's being paid across all stakeholders. It used to be, again, a dozen years ago or so or more, you didn't have such a thing as sustainability investing in the sort of the mainstream. You had it in your green funds, but you didn't have it as a major part of what most large, whether they're passive or active funds are doing. You didn't have a lot of attention on this in the C-suite. And if you did, it was probably because you were a utility or you were a Molson Coors and you needed clean water to make beer or something like that. But in the sort of mainstream, it wasn't really something that you saw in the C-suite. Now it's unquestionably there. It's there in a big way, and it's being driven by everyone. It's being driven now by every single stakeholder of a corporation. Every single category of stakeholders of a corporation is driving this effort. What I see in the near term, and this is through my own lens, being the general counsel of a public company, I see the need for companies and boards to get on the same page. And I mean that relative to their, not only the strategies and the tactics that will constitute their sustainability strategy, but also the cadence that they deal with each other. If I think back 10 years and I think about risk management, we started to talk about enterprise risk management. That might have been a new term 15 years ago. It's been around for a while and boards are still trying to sort of kind of figure out what to do with it. And we've got a pretty decent cadence there, but it took time. I think that's today's ESG. We got to figure out how the boards are gonna work with management on this.
That's fabulous.
And as far as the future, if I could predict the future, I'd be down at the south end of town, so I don't really have much to say there.
Sandy.
So I love how Mariella said, today we're seeing more top-down, and that's with the newcomers to the market. I started my journey with AEP in 2006, and I was definitely pushing it up the hill. So it's really rewarding to see how far we have come, but we still have a long way to go. If you remember, well, it still is, a lot of what we're doing today from an ESG perspective is still voluntary. It's not mandatory, except if you're in the EU, for example, or some other parts of the world, but it's voluntary. And that presents challenges because we don't have the types of controls and processes in place today that you have on the financial reporting side. We're moving in that direction because of the SEC proposed draft rule on climate, which will then be followed by human capital management. So take a good chunk of your sustainability report and move it into your 10K is really what we're talking. And that's a huge, huge shift, and it's going to take some time. I think I like to say that I think ESG today has street cred. I remember the day when my CFO, probably 2 CFOs ago, came in after an analyst meeting and said, "What is ESG?" And he's the CFO, and he had never heard that term before. And I thought, well, there's the door. It just opened. And it's been, we've been moving full speed ahead ever since. So I think, we're more mature than we were. Certainly, we have a long way to go, and it's mainstream. It's not a niche. It's not, a fad. There are still people who think that, but they're wrong. And the reason is because I'm seeing ESG affect every part of our business. It affects our ability to gain access to capital, the cost of capital, our credit ratings, the ability to insure our assets. That's huge. So those are some of the impacts that ESG has and why it has to and is being managed more strategically and thoughtfully in companies today compared to maybe 5 or 6 or 8 years ago.
What I thought might be interesting is if we can shift a little bit and think about some of the challenges that we're seeing. And, there is some negative opinions about ESG, and there's some motivations in that space. And I thought it might be a bit of a unique question to respond to in today's forum. But if you were up for the challenge, Marielle, I thought I would pitch that up to you if you'd like to make a comment.
Yeah, so I think I said it in my opening speech. I think we need the ESG backlash. It will help us get better. I strongly believe that we are just at the start of this. And yes, it is moving into more mandatory territory, and I think the regulatory pressures help get these newcomers on board. But I feel strongly about our responsibility as service providers to build products that are fit for purpose. And we see ourselves as we want to be the category king of ESG strategy setting and risk management, and that's entirely new. So a lot of companies, they're telling us we are inventing this as we go, and we want to be that partner that can help invent it. We want to be challenged, and we want to be challenging. So I think, for that reason, the ESG backlash is helpful. And with anything that is becoming popular, you get people that are against it. So I think it just tells that we are at a different level of maturity as an industry, although I don't like to use the word ESG industry because this is all about integration. It just means that we have arrived at a certain level. We need to go further up now.
Yeah, and I could not agree more. Positive and negative opinions both have the same end result, and that's elevating awareness, and that's what we need. The awareness leads to the impetus to make change, to integrate, as our two brilliant colleagues have done in their own organizations. So if I can move to Sandy and Pete to talk about their best practices, some sort of tips and little giveaways to those who are here with us today. Some of the things that you're doing internally, some of the things that you're seeing other corporations in your industry doing, and maybe just some general advice on how to tackle the challenges that are before you. So, Pete, can I start with you?
Sure. So I think the first thing is sort of know yourself, know your company, know what you're capable of, and know what's important to your organization and to your stakeholders. It's two different things. What you don't want to do is embark on a program or take action that you're not equipped to take, because you can't fail here. You need to succeed, and so don't bite off more than you can chew, or prepare yourself to hire the talent, hire the headcount, hire the people you need in order to go do the things you want to do. But understand and stay within those sort of parameters. And then secondly, understand what's driving the need for this and what's important to your stakeholders. I think that's the critical piece here. Sustainability strategy or ESG strategy, or pick a portion of it strategy, it doesn't materialize out of thin air because somebody in the C-suite says, "Hey, I think it'd be really cool if we checked our supply chain for child labor." It doesn't happen that way. It happens because your constituents, whether that's your investors, whether that's your employees, whether that's your customers or suppliers, they pull you there. They tell you what's important to them. And if you don't know, you got to go find out. We did this twice. We did it in 2018, and we did it by ourselves, and it was okay, but it wasn't insightful. Basically sort of reaffirmed everything we kind of thought because we were the ones sitting in the room. We did it again in 2020, and this time we did it with the Datamaran tool, and the insights that we were able to get and the people we were able to reach and the ways that we were able to slice the data to tell us what's important and what others are doing in those same spots really started to give us the insight to then go and craft that strategy. It doesn't, just like anything else, doesn't produce the strategy for you, produces those insights that allow you to say, okay, yes, this is what I thought. I'm going to affirm that my stakeholders want this or they don't want that. It allows you to go craft that strategy that works for you. So stay within your capabilities so you're not setting yourself up for failure, and know what's important.
I like to say, don't boil the ocean. You don't need to. Really just focus on what's most relevant to you. So there are a few things. I think one of the most important things that we can do to be effective in leading ESG within our companies is, number one, to listen to people and let them be heard, but also be collaborative and build consensus. You can't just say we're going to do a human rights policy because we have to. You have to bring people along and educate them. And to your point about materiality assessment, we had done our first one in 2012, I think it was, and I didn't want to go through that painful process. It took us almost 8 months, 9 months or longer to get that done. And Datamaran gave us the opportunity to do it really fast, not really, really fast, but in a more expeditious way, be able to check it more frequently, see where those material issues are going. And then that materiality assessment was really critical to being able to form a cross-functional team to oversee ESG for the company. So I brought in, this was just 5 years ago. I saw ESG really starting to ramp up, and I thought, well, I'm hearing about how it's touching all these different parts of the business. It's time that all those people are at the table and hear from each other, and then we can make sure that we've got all of our collective ears to the ground and know what's going on and how it's affecting the company. So I brought together legal from a governance perspective. I brought together our chief risk officer, our deputy treasurer, environmental services and climate. We now have our chief diversity officer as part of that group, corporate communications, and my team from corporate sustainability. And we'll add people as we need to, but that group meets on a monthly basis and has been for a number of years. And it's a really important meeting, and we get great engagement. Oh, investor relations is also on that team. And so bringing the materiality assessment results first to that group to validate, does this make sense from what you're seeing and what you're hearing in the business? And then we took that and we took our risk register and lined those things up and said, where's the connections? Show me is this really a risk? Is it an opportunity? Where's the intersection? And it was very cool to be able to show both the ESG committee, the Enterprise Sustainability Council, and ultimately the board of directors, how the materiality assessment was helping us to manage. It is a control we use to manage our risks with the company. ESG is actually on our risk register. And I actually have to report up to the risk executive committee several times a year on how we're managing that. We've actually seen that risk decline, but it comes with a caution. The controls are working. You can't take your foot off the gas. You've got to keep going forward, or you will very quickly slip back, and you can see that risk increase again. So I think really being aware of what the risks are, and then the materiality assessment is really important. Putting those things together, having that cross-functional team from a collaboration perspective, they have the ear of the executives all the way up to the C-suite and into the C-suite. Some of them are. And so that's extremely valuable as well. And, the chief risk officer and I, she's at the board. I think we're actually at the governance committee at the same time every year together. And so it's great. We're about to embark on a double materiality assessment, and she and I are the co-sponsors. So that's a very cool relationship. And we talk all the time about, what is going on out there. I cannot stress enough the importance of the collaboration piece of it and being able to facilitate bringing people together, because you can't do this in a silo. You have to do it. You have to be able to work across the enterprise.
Sandy reminded me of one important one I want to
Please,
throw in there,
please.
because the cross-functional collaboration is huge. Whatever you do in the context of building a program or tackling a task, you do it cross-functionally and do it within the confines or within the values, or tie it to the values of your particular business. Example, our business, we run on a system called the Fordham Business System. It's the lifeblood of our organization. It has certain tools, certain concepts, certain things that we do. When we want to get something done inside the sustainability program, we use those tools, we use those concepts, we speak that language, because that the senior people who are listening, they're tied directly in because they're hearing the same words and they're seeing the same thing in action. If you have values in your organization, we have 4 values. One of them is build extraordinary teams. We tie sustainability and what we're doing in our program to how does that go and build an extraordinary team for us. So tie it to your values, your business system, tie it to something in the organization, because that will make it less ambiguous and less opaque.
I love the words I hear, tying it together, communication, regular integration. You can hear the takeaway is this concept of embedding this in every decision-making process that you're engaging in. And it's, ESG has moved away from being sort of the cost center, and now it's a place for opportunity and growth and good management.
If I could just add on to that real quick.
Please.
That's so important. I'm fairly new in this role, but I've been at AP leading sustainability for a long time. So I'm going through this listening tour, if you will, with all of our executives. And I start out by telling them, listen, I own absolutely nothing. You own it all. But I am embedded within the entire organization, and I need to be able to work across that company, across the company. So help me to be most effective and tied to that business unit. So, I don't own anything. The accountability really lies across the organization, and that's really important. You can't say the CSO, the sustainability group, the ESG person owns this. No, the business owns this. We just are the ones who are overseeing it and bringing it together, and that's really important.
Wonderful add on. Could you cap it, Mariella, with some thoughts about best practices that you're seeing? Certainly using Datamaran. We can all agree on that. But maybe a few others.
Yeah, I think in the European context, I'm hearing a lot of executives talk about shared responsibility. So collaboration across the finance function with sustainability, with the general counsel. And I think that is, it's new, but there's this realization that sustainability folks need to be more strategic and are part of that conversation. And I think that, as Sandy pointed out, that kind of cross-collaboration is essential. Also, what we're seeing increasingly is this focus on ESG integration into the annual report. I remember being at a CFO event, all Dutch company CFOs, that said, oh, all of a sudden, we are responsible for that piece of information, for those ESG disclosures. We're starting to look at it right now. And guess what? Our CEO talks about it. So we need to understand what we are saying, and also if we are delivering upon those promises. And then there's the risk register piece as well. So I think there's a lot of talk with CFOs, CROs around how do we marry relevant ESG information, material ESG risks and opportunities, with our risk management process. And we need data to do that. So for us at Datamaran, all of those things are interesting for our product roadmap. So at Current, we have more of a generic focus, I would say. And the generic focus is very much around identification and prioritization and monitoring of these issues, and then giving companies the evidence, where is this coming from? How is this driving it? But I think in future, we'll see more crystallized use cases per department. So the CFO will have a specific need, the general counsel will have a specific need, and yes, there's this overall shared responsibility, but there will also be more specific needs. And I think that for us is exciting, is interesting,
Very exciting.
as we like to build things.
Yeah, very, very exciting. I think we're at a point where we might be able to welcome some questions.
First of all, just wanted to say a huge thank you to Mariella and then also Barbara for organizing this. My question here is actually towards to Sandy. Okay. In my consulting background prior to going in-house here, worked with a lot of the utilities in the Midwest and looking at their net zero transition plans and TCFD work and everything. And many of the companies here, any industry, rely on our utilities being at net zero by 2035, which is the target that the Biden administration has set in line with IEA. Now, AEP's done a great job. I've looked at a lot of them. They already have their target out for 2030 there to be 50%. They've invested heavily in renewable
80%, sorry.
80% there.
80%.
Okay, we've got that. So my question is, in keeping with the topic here, E is not easy. What are you seeing as being the biggest challenges for the utilities to hit that 100% by 2035?
Yeah, a lot of different things. So I think that, first of all, we're a regulated utility, which means that our state regulators have to approve it. We are in what are known as red states for the most part. So 8 of the 19 attorneys general who signed the letter to BlackRock, those are 8 of our states. So it's very challenging to navigate in West Virginia, for example, the heart of coal country, and make the case for just shut it down. You know, we need to get out of coal. We will eventually get out of coal. There's no question. But you have to bring those states along. And I like to share a story about a couple of years ago in West Virginia. For the longest time, it was, hell no, we won't go. Nothing but coal, nothing but fossil in West Virginia. But a couple of years ago, the state legislature approved a law that allows up to 50 megawatts. I think it's 50 or 200. It's not a lot. I think it's more like 50 megawatts of solar to be built in the state. And, you know, it's not a lot, right? But to me, that was a huge opening because they're beginning to realize that they cannot have robust economic growth without clean energy and providing access to that in that state. So the regulatory and political constructs are certainly huge to navigate for utilities. I think some of the challenges we see now as well are the economics. You know, fuel costs are very high. Can we get to clean energy that eliminates that fuel cost? That's where we want to go as fast as we can. But it's you know, the grid that's out there now is over 100 years old. And so it takes a lot of investment to modernize that grid so that you can have solar panels that when you're not using it, flows that energy back to the grid. And when your solar panels aren't working, you get the energy off the grid. So there's a ton of investment. My company alone is investing about $3 billion a year. That's pretty significant. And then, you know, so we're going as fast as we can. We've reduced our carbon emissions. We're actually at a 70% reduction now, and our goal is 80% by 2030. Right now, our net zero is 2050, but we evaluate those goals on an annual basis. We're counting on technology and new resources like hydrogen. We're counting on battery storage, small modular nuclear. You need something to back up renewables because it's so intermittent. If the sun isn't shining, the wind's not blowing, you have no electricity in your house. I mean, that's the reality. So natural gas will be part of that bridge to the future, but technology is what we're hanging our hats on. And we're investing as an industry very heavily in developing those technologies. There's actually 2 different initiatives. One is really focused on the post-2030, because those are the least mature technologies. And then there's one that's really focusing on the more near term, but also the physical risk. How do we adapt, the adaptation that we're going to need in the interim until all of these things come together? So those are some of the real challenges that you know, that we're facing. And we have to make sure that as we make this transition, that it is affordable, that we can provide affordable, reliable, resilient electricity that is equitable and accessible to every single customer. We have to be really careful that we don't end up with a grid where you can afford to pay for clean energy and they cannot. We have to make sure that the investments enable universal access to clean energy. And that's, you know, we're working as an industry to try to figure that out, but when you're dealing with a system that's over 100 years old, and it was built to break and then rebuild. I mean, that's how it was built. I mean, that's what, when you see poles and wires, that's what it is. And so we're trying to, and we are going pretty fast. We've made, you know, huge strides, and we'll continue to push it. And, you know, we have plenty of people and organizations and investors and suppliers and customers who are pushing us as well. And that's a good thing. And that's how we got to some of our goals. We've actually had carbon reduction goals since the early 2000s, which for a coal-burning electric utility at that time was huge. We did that as part of the Chicago Climate Exchange initially, but then it was only a couple of years ago that we set a net zero target, which was a very big deal for us. So progress, but there are huge, huge challenges out there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sandy. Do we have another question?
Hi, I'm Tushar Sundarani. I'm an MBA student at Fordham University. ESG, I think, is picking up significantly back in India as well. I used to work as an equity research analyst, and companies, the CEOs, CFOs used to talk a lot about. They've started in the last 2 years. That's been a big focus area, talking to investors specifically. My question is regarding the conversation that we have around it. Some of it, I don't believe, is as honest as it should be. Some ESG does involve compromises, but it's kind of painted as this thing where you can maintain profitability, you can do all of that. Maybe near term, some of it, at least in my opinion, when you're investing, when you're doing all of that, requires some bit of taking a hit for the long run. But considering we live in this age where everything's short-termist and everyone's kind of focusing on short-term, how do we have this conversation where it's okay to take a near-term hit, or will that never happen? And people kind of say it's all good, like there's no compromises, which I believe is not true. What do you think about that?
You can go first.
I'll take a shot.
Giving it to the attorney. Here we go.
I'll take a shot at part of that. So short-termism has been an issue in the corporate world, particularly public company corporate world, for a very, very long time. I think the evolution of ESG, where you really take a hit, depends on your investor base. I'm speaking now for a public company. These concepts kind of roll over, but I'll speak just for a public company. Where you're going to take a hit from that perspective is either your investors or your sell-side analysts who are going to paint you with a terrible brush. More and more companies and investors are getting tighter on this topic. They're more aligned on this topic because they're starting to talk about it. So investors, I think, by and large, are a little more flexible than they used to be. The same thing is happening with the sell-side analysts. If you talk about it correctly, you're starting to, I think, get cut a little bit more of a break, particularly if otherwise you're operationally sound. If you're not, you're going to get creamed anyway. So I'm starting to see a little bit of, even in this short-termism sort of oriented world, the ability to do things for the long-term interest that also have the short-term ESG benefit and the ability to sell that to your stakeholders. So that's maybe a point of hopefulness here. That's not the case all the time and in every way, shape, or form. And again, it's not the case if you miss 2 or 3 quarters in a row, because now the short-termists are just going to say, well, you got to do something to right the ship, and things are going to change. A lot of that's about credibility. But the last thing I'll say, because we talked about the ESG backlash, and Sandy mentioned the 19 attorneys general that wrote this letter. There is a backlash right now on the fiduciary obligation of directors relative to making ESG-oriented decisions. I read I think it was the Indiana Attorney General's opinion on this, and while the reasoning sounds sound in that opinion, I would disagree with it 100%. I think a lot of people feel like I do, because the reality is, for years, particularly in Delaware, fiduciary law has evolved in a way that gives boards of directors, a vast amount of deference to make business-oriented decisions in the long-term interests of their shareholders. And so something might be a short-term hit, but if the board thinks that on a long-term basis it's going to benefit their shareholders, forget stakeholders for a minute, it's going to benefit their shareholders, then that's subject to the business judgment rule, and they have a wide variety, a wide swath of deference for that decision. And so I think that helps a little bit, because we're going to start having this argument now, and Delaware is going to have to address it, and other people are going to have to address it. But I think my hope is that ends up the right way and continues to give the board that deference to make decisions that the board thinks are in the best interest, long-term interest of shareholders.
Excellent. And I think that the concept of shifting this responsibility from the short term to the long term is an important lens to push back on some of the negativity that we're hearing. So we have a gentleman in the front. Go for it.
Thank you, Richard Howard. 2 questions. One to Mariella. I think the positioning that you're saying about the so-called ESG backlash is the right one, and if I was you, I'd be saying exactly the same thing, and congratulations. To some extent, I think the motivation of the people that are criticizing the data providers, the credit rating agencies, is not because you're getting it all wrong. And I know you well enough that I'm sure you made mistakes. You're not perfect, but you've got a very, very serious product with a very serious team over a long time. And that the criticism is not motivated by the quality of what you or your peers are doing. It's motivated by not liking it in the first place. And isn't it right that we also challenge that and recognise that that's part of the battle we're in? And to either Pete or to Sandy, I come from Europe. I was responsible for the project that got the TCFD recommendations into the major voluntary sustainability reporting frameworks, including the GRI. I think the rest of the world needs the US to adopt the SEC guidelines on climate disclosure. And although I respect that domestic politics is none of my business, if we're going to hit the IPCC target to get emissions down by 50% by 2030, you've got to get on with it in the States. And I apologise for speaking as bluntly as that.
Okay.
But the rest of the world is watching here. And if that doesn't happen, what's going to happen? Or there's a huge hole in the jigsaw. So give us a corporate America answer that gives me some optimism when I go back from Climate Week this week.
Oh, gee. I think there's been a lot of activity that is supporting the acceleration of the push towards clean energy and I always want to say infrastructure. The Inflation Reduction Act that was recently approved, that's going to do a lot for pushing forward renewables in particular, but accelerating other technologies. There are hydrogen hubs showing up in different parts of the country. By extending the tax credits, that's a major incentive for developers to build renewables. So I think you're going to see, some activity in the next few years. Actually, I will also just remind you that it's a global issue, not a United States issue, and not a single company or a single country. But we absolutely have to do more. There's no question about it. And I love the TCFD framework. We actually published our last climate analysis was a TCFD report, and I really love that framework. I think it really makes a lot of sense. And I'm really glad to see the SEC really looked at it and drew from that. So,
Yeah, if I may respond to your first remark, I think the ESG backlash folks, right? They're thinking about this in a very binary way, and they're politicizing it. And I think that with the best arguments, you're not going to convince. So to me, that's the category of the skeptics. And they can be there, and it's okay. I think from a business perspective, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this book, Crossing the Chasm. You always have when you look at people, you have the early adopters, then you have the pragmatists that are following, and then you have the late majority, and then you have the skeptics. I see this in the same way. So I think with my team and with the ESG community at large, I think we need to just focus on all the good stuff there's to do. I wouldn't fight that fight, and I don't think there's a point fighting that fight. I think it is an illustration of how much this topic has reached certain levels of conversation. I remember earlier days when we were talking to investors, angel investors, London City people, and they would say, oh, your business, it's going to be such a headache for companies. So this is going to work out because this is great business, it's subscriptions, it's technology. So they were in it maybe for the wrong reasons. But I'll take that, I think we have to move ahead. And that's been our perspective. There's a lot of early adopters. I think now we see the pragmatists following, and I think the regulators are getting the late majority in. And the skeptics, I don't know what's going to happen to them.
They'll be behind us anyway, so we don't have to look at them.
For, for the
Do
sake
you
of
want to add
yeah,
a bit?
yeah, for the sake of dialogue, I could offer a different point of view. I'm going closing in on 30 years as a corporate lawyer, so and I'm skeptical of any regulation. I don't know what the SEC rules will do at the end of the day. If you think about the most highlighted and talked about pieces of it, it does nothing other than make me tell the story of what I'm already doing. So there's no mandate around reducing emissions. There's nothing that would make me change my behavior. I just have to talk about my behavior. There are some things, though, that are problematic. And I hear people in the C-suite talk about this when they talk about these rules all the time. And I'm not talking about greedy capitalists. I'm talking about people who otherwise want to do these things and are true believers in this. But they say things like, well, if there's a severe weather event and one line item on my P&L is impacted by 1% or more, I have to quantify that and describe it and do a footnote about it? Like Sandy mentioned how financial disclosure has taken decades to develop and it's still developing. How are we possibly going to do that? Practically
every
speaking,
storm
practically speaking,
related.
it's a severe weather event. It's not even defined, right? So practically speaking, how do we do that? Climate scenario analysis. If you want to do a climate scenario analysis under the SEC rules, guess what? You got to disclose it. So, well, why would I do one then? I can figure it out some other way. So I think the SEC here, it's not the SEC riding to the rescue. It's just not. It's us that's going to do all this. First of all, it's us that have done it so far, and we've done a pretty good job, I think. But it's us who are going to continue to do it. We're the ones who are going to set the guidelines. You're the ones who are going to pressure. We're all the ones who are going to pressure all of our stakeholders and constituents to go down this path. And the SEC is playing catch up. At the end of the day, this is all about, but they're really playing catch up, I think. So that didn't probably encourage you very much. But you can go back with that point of view as an alternate if you choose.
Or you could stay longer. We'd be happy to have you.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm not just saying that the regulators have no role to play here. I'm just saying I don't think that this is as bold and big as people. It's costly, and there are bad parts of it, but I don't think this is going to change the world. I think we're going to change the world, and investment is going to change the world. The Inflation Reduction Act is going to do worlds more good for what we want to accomplish than the SEC disclosure rules, I think.
Yep.
2 more questions. I have someone in the back who you have with the microphone. So here's our penultimate question, right? And then we have one more after this.
So first of all, thank you for having this panel. Very, very interesting. My name is Gal. I am also a corporate attorney turned for the best, entering the ESG world. And I found it very interesting, Sandy, that you mentioned how you're bringing in the legal and the risk and all those companies, but then hearing from a general counsel that it's more on the rare side of hearing general counsel being so much involved in ESG. And my question is, how do we get more lawyers and more general counsel to sit on those tables of the ESG discussion and really get them to understand the intersection between ESG and the law and why it's so important?
You're the lawyer.
I have a couple thoughts there. I think one is just the continuation of this movement is going to, by its nature, result in more C-suite interactivity, and that's going to draw in the general counsel, no matter where the sustainability program or ESG rests inside the org. So I think we have that benefit of momentum. But secondly, and this is where I think, when I think about what I use Datamaran for is 2 things, really. It's materiality, what's important, and then it's risk and risk management. And the bigger ESG becomes, the more important ESG risk management becomes to your board, to your organization, and to your stakeholders because, and here's a place where the SEC rules will do some good, you got to talk about it. You got to get out there and talk about how you manage climate risk. And so lawyers, ESG can sit in various places in an organization, but risk ultimately always goes to the general counsel, right? And it's pretty rare your general counsel and your chief compliance or chief risk officer are separated. It's pretty rare, unless you're a regulated bank or something maybe. But so ultimately, I think it's talking about those risks, how you're managing those risks, what's the impact of those risks long-term and short-term on your organization, making all of that make sense, And if you put it inside of that lens, you're naturally going to draw not just the attention, but the accountability of the general counsel and the legal team.
And for the record, I report to the general counsel. So, it's actually great because he's the corporate secretary, so that's my liaison to the board. So it's a really good match.
Out of curiosity, how many attorneys do we have in the room? Oh, and I'm pleased that your hands are held high. We have one more question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm going to follow up from the SEC conversation by asking, one of the other things I'm hearing is that it could create a race to the bottom instead of a race to the top. What is the likelihood, whether it's SEC or CSRD or any other regulation that might come down the line, that companies are going to get so scared of the lawyers, who are very important, that they're going to stop reporting all the wonderful voluntary things that we report now? Because I'm a little concerned about, once we start putting it all into the 10K, it's going to get stripped of a lot of meaningful things. So I wonder if you could reflect on that.
I think that's a
and
real
should continue.
concern.
Yeah.
That is a real concern. Will companies even start to pull back on their targets because they don't have a detailed pathway, because there's so much unknown? I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in 2050 or 24, even 2040, even 2035. I have no idea. So that is a very real concern. In my industry, we've had this conversation a lot about, around scope 3. So scope 3 is really important for the combination utilities in particular, those who have electricity, but they also have natural gas distribution, because that's the methane. And the SEC, as the rule says now, you have to disclose it if it's in a target. Well, I have some peers who put it in their target. I'm like, I wouldn't do that, because we have scope 3 is so squishy. There's no real good standards or anything for how you, methodology, I guess is what I'm saying. So that is a very real risk, and those conversations are happening. I think at the end of the day, companies will not pull back, but I do agree that there's a risk of less robust narrative that explains the data and why you're doing what you're doing. And that is, I think, the risk.
And if I can add, once it ends up in that space, then you're looking at a whole nother set of requirements in terms of the auditability of it, in terms of risk management of it. So I think in the short term, you probably will see that, because if you're going to do reporting in the 10K, you've got to worry about the comparability from year to year. So if you're setting targets, you have to make sure that you can follow up on them. In ESG, there's not a lot of compatibility reporting. You can have an ESG report say that this is what they're going to do, and then the next year it can be something different. No one really gets upset about it, because it's all done with this impression of forward thinking and optimism and looking to share all the things that we're trying to strive for. But once you flip it to the other paradigm, you will see a change, and that's part of what we're going to see is this long journey. If you take that perspective, you can say that's what goes on now in the financial reporting piece. Did we dummy down financial reporting? Do we report to the lowest level? I mean, in some ways you can say that some of the things that you're seeing that are gap required does hit those kinds of elements that you're saying that you're fearful of. We're experiencing it now. So I think it's a brilliant question. And Pete, and then
it's really thought-provoking.
very thought-provoking.
I do think that, and here I will have some optimism for the crowd. I think that ultimately what's going to prevent that is what's ignited it in the first place, which is the views of your employees and stakeholders who want you to talk about this stuff and disclose this stuff. And most, I want to say most, a very, very high percentage of organizations and people are doing this because they want to, and because they believe in it, and because they're getting pressured. But it's not hard to succumb to the pressure when you believe in what you're doing. So so I think maybe not a race to the bottom from that perspective. I will contrast that, for example, with, anybody familiar with conflict minerals? The bane of every public company's existence a decade ago or whatever it was. Nobody was asking about conflict minerals. Nobody, no shareholder was saying, are you sourcing tungsten from nobody was. I'm not belittling the issue, by the way, it's a significant issue. But I'm saying in terms of disclosure regimes, It was thrown out there as I think it was part of Dodd-Frank.
It is part of Dodd-Frank.
It was thrown out there and so all the corporate people said, why are we doing this? And that was a race to the bottom. Disclose the minimum that you need to disclose to satisfy a rule that no shareholder or any other very, very, very few stakeholders were coming to you saying, I want you to disclose it. This is completely different. Everybody's coming to you saying, I want you to do this, I want you to do it. So even in the absence of the SEC regs, full stop, we'd still be doing it. So that's my point of optimism.
Mirella, can you tap this? Can you put a cap on this for us and be our last response to this brilliant question?
So, very good question. I don't have the crystal ball either, but I would say there's two separate sides to this story. So on the one hand, we have disclosure. On the other hand, we have the new business reality and understanding the world we operate in. So at Datamaran, we track 400 of these issues. Climate, GHG, is one of the issues. So I think we've been talking about standardization and frameworks and getting more comparability and consistency forever. And I think that is a good cause. But I think in the meantime, a lot of these issues impact business today, your ability to be successful. So you better understand how climate impacts you today. So, and that also plays into risk and opportunity.
Absolutely.
But I think a lot of companies will continue to move this forward because it is a competitive advantage and because of the ability to attract capital, but even more importantly, the ability to attract talent.
And I want to thank our extraordinary panelists, and I also thank you all for joining us today.